As you can see by the documentation I have right here, the structure clearly violates the setback agreement. I suggest you cease construction until this is resolved.
The first thing I saw when I stepped into my backyard was not the sunrise, or the dogwood trees my mother helped me plant, or the little stone path I had spent 2 weekends setting by hand. It was a gray storage shed, half finished, sitting where no building should have been sitting. One corner of it was planted deep inside my yard, its fresh concrete footing cutting across my grass like someone had drawn a new property line while I was asleep. Before I could even understand what I was looking at, my neighbor Linda Carter came storming around the side of the shed with her face flushed red and her phone clenched in her hand. Behind her stood Mark Ellison, the HOA president, holding a folder like he was serving court papers. A contractor in a dusty black hoodie kept dragging lumber across my lawn as if my backyard had already stopped belonging to me. Linda pointed straight at my chest and shouted that the project had been approved, that I was trespassing near her construction area, and that I needed to get back inside before I caused trouble. Mark stepped forward with that calm, arrogant HOA voice people use when they think a title on a neighborhood board makes them untouchable. He told me the shed was part of an approved improvement, that the board had reviewed the location, and that any interference from me would result in daily fines. Then I saw the trench line painted in orange spray paint. It ran from Linda's side yard, around the shed, and straight through the back corner of my property. They were not just building on my land, they were getting ready to run electrical service through it. I remember standing there in my slippers, staring at a contractor's boot print pressed into the flower bed beside my mother's tree, while Linda smiled like she had already won. She had wanted those extra few feet for years. I had always said no. Now she had the HOA standing beside her, a contractor working behind her, and a half-built shed sitting on my grass like a dare. What none of them knew was that 3 weeks later, that same shed would have a stop work order slapped across its front wall. The contractor would be questioned by the permit office. The HOA would be forced into an emergency meeting. And Linda, who told everyone I was just being difficult, would stand in her driveway watching the building she bragged about get taken apart board by board. But before all of that happened, before the county got involved and before the truth came out, I had to understand how a quiet little strip of backyard became the place where my neighbor and my HOA decided they could steal from me in broad daylight. I bought that house because it felt like the first quiet thing I had ever truly earned. It was not big, not fancy, and definitely not the kind of place people drove by slowly to admire. It was a modest, single-story home at the end of a curved street in a planned neighborhood, with trimmed lawns, matching mailboxes, and an HOA that sent too many emails about trash bins. But to me, it was peace. It was the place I came back to after years of renting apartments where I could hear every argument through the walls and where every parking spot felt temporary. My name is Daniel Reed, and at the time this happened, I was 43, working remotely as a project coordinator for a logistics company. My life was not dramatic. I paid my bills, kept my lawn clean, waved to people when I walked to the mailbox, and tried not to get involved in neighborhood politics. I was not the guy who complained about every leaf blowing into his driveway. I was not the guy who argued at HOA meetings just to hear himself talk. I wanted exactly what most people want when they finally buy a home. I wanted my space to be respected. The backyard was the reason I signed the papers. It had a small stretch of grass, a narrow stone path, and 2 dogwood trees near the back corner. My mother helped me plant those trees the first spring after I moved in. She was already sick then, though none of us wanted to say it out loud. She sat in a folding chair with a sun hat on, telling me the roots needed room and the soil needed patience. A year later, she was gone. After that, those trees stopped being landscaping. They became the last living thing we had put in the ground together. That back corner of the yard was where I drank coffee before work, where I sat when I needed to clear my head, and where I kept a small wooden bench that had belonged to my father. It was not valuable in a way an appraiser would care about, but it was valuable to me. So when Linda Carter started making comments about that side of the property, I noticed. Linda lived directly behind and slightly beside me, where our lots met at an awkward angle. She had moved in about 2 years after I did. At first, she seemed friendly enough. She waved, asked about the neighborhood, and talked constantly about improving her property value. But over time, her friendliness started to feel like pressure. She complained that her backyard felt cramped. She said the old fence line made no sense. She mentioned more than once that I had a few feet I was not really using. One afternoon, she even suggested I sell her a strip of my yard so she could build a larger outdoor workspace. I told her no as politely as I could. I explained that the land was part of my deed, that I had no interest in changing the boundary, and that I liked my yard the way it was. She smiled, but it was the kind of smile people use when they are not accepting your answer. After that, things changed. She stopped waving. She started making little comments in the community group about homeowners who refused to support improvements. Then she got close to Mark Ellison. Mark was the HOA president, and he acted like the neighborhood was a private kingdom he had been chosen to rule. The HOA had been annoying before him, but manageable. Under Mark, every small issue became a violation notice. Trash cans left out too long. Garden beds not approved in writing. Fence stains that were one shade too dark. He loved procedure when it helped him, and ignored procedure when it got in his way. I still tried to stay out of it. I kept copies of my deed, closing documents, and survey in a file cabinet, but I never imagined I would need them. To me, property lines were simple. You bought land, recorded it with the county, paid taxes on it, and everyone respected the boundary. I had no idea that a neighbor with an agenda and an HOA president with an ego could turn a few quiet feet of grass into a battlefield. And if you have ever dealt with an HOA or a neighbor who thinks your silence means weakness, you already know how quickly a small issue can become something much darker. Leave your thoughts in the comments, because sometimes the most expensive fights do not start with a lawsuit. They start with someone deciding your property is easier to take than to ask for. By the time Linda's shed appeared in my yard, I realized she had not been making casual comments for months. She had been studying the spot. She had been waiting for the right person to give her permission. And unfortunately for both of us, Mark Ellison was exactly the kind of person who believed his approval mattered more than my deed. The shed did not appear all at once. That was the part that made it feel even worse. It started with noise on a Saturday morning, sharp metallic sounds coming from the back fence while I was still making coffee. At first, I thought someone was repairing a gate. Then came the low rumble of a truck backing up, the scrape of lumber sliding across metal, and the heavy thud of something being dropped onto the ground. When I stepped outside, 2 workers were standing between my yard and Linda's, removing a section of the old fence like they had every right to be there. One of them had already pulled 3 boards loose. Another was rolling a wheelbarrow straight across my grass, leaving a dark track in the dew. Linda stood nearby in sunglasses and a bright white jacket, holding a clipboard she clearly wanted people to notice. She did not look surprised to see me. She looked prepared. I asked what was going on, and she answered with the calm confidence of someone who had rehearsed the moment. She said the HOA had approved her new shed, that the board had reviewed the placement, and that the fence was being adjusted to match the correct neighborhood plan. She made it sound official, like I was the one who had missed a meeting or ignored a notice. But the fence they were removing was not on her side. The wheelbarrow was not on her side. The stacked lumber was not on her side. It was all sitting in the back corner of my yard, only a few feet from the dogwoods. I told the workers to stop until we could verify the property line. The foreman barely looked at me. He said they were hired to build where the customer and HOA told them to build, and if I had a problem, I needed to take it up with Linda or the board. Then he turned away and kept working. That was when Mark Ellison arrived. He came through Linda's side gate carrying a folder under one arm, moving slowly, like he wanted everyone to see him enter. He did not ask what happened. He did not ask why there were contractors on my lawn. He looked at me like I was already guilty of causing trouble. He said this project had been reviewed as a community improvement, and he expected me to cooperate. I asked him to show me the survey he used to approve the location. He did not have one. I asked him to show me the county permit. He said county permitting was not my concern. I asked him what gave the HOA the right to approve construction on my property. His expression changed then, just slightly, like I had asked a question he did not want asked in front of the workers. Instead of answering, he opened his folder and handed me a printed notice. It accused me of obstructing an approved contractor and warned that continued interference could result in fines of $250 per day. The paper had the HOA letterhead at the top, Mark's signature at the bottom, and absolutely nothing in between that explained how my backyard had suddenly become available for Linda's storage shed. Linda watched me read it with a small smile. She reminded me that the old fence had always been treated as the boundary, and that if I had concerns, I should have raised them years earlier. Then she said the board was tired of homeowners blocking reasonable upgrades because of personal feelings. She spoke loudly enough for the workers to hear. She wanted me embarrassed on my own property. The construction continued for the rest of the day. They set forms for the concrete footing, and part of it cut across the grass on my side in a clean, ugly line. A worker dragged a stack of panels over my stone path and cracked one of the pavers near the bench. Someone left muddy boot prints around the base of my mother's tree. When I stepped closer to photograph the damage, Linda told Mark I was harassing her crew. By Monday, the frame of the shed was standing. By Tuesday, the roof panels were on. By Wednesday, orange paint appeared across the ground, marking the trench where they planned to run electricity. That line crossed the back corner of my yard, as if my deed, my taxes, and my permission meant nothing. Then the emails started. The HOA claimed I had created a hostile environment for approved contractors. They ordered me not to move materials, not to place objects near the construction area, and not to interfere with Linda's use of what they called a shared maintenance strip. They also warned that photographing workers without permission could be treated as harassment under community rules. That was the moment the anger finally settled into something colder. They were not confused. They were not making a harmless mistake. Linda wanted land she did not own. Mark wanted to prove the HOA could force me to accept it, and the contractor wanted to finish the job before anyone asked too many questions. I could have screamed. I could have dragged the lumber back across the fence. I could have made the kind of scene they were clearly waiting for, the kind they could use against me in a hearing. Instead, I stood at my kitchen window, watched a worker carry another board across my grass, and started recording everything. I did not go outside and yell. I did not touch the lumber, block the workers, or give Linda the scene she clearly wanted. I had spent enough years dealing with difficult people at work to know when someone was trying to bait me into looking unstable. If I lost control, even for 10 seconds, Mark would turn it into another HOA violation. Linda would tell the neighborhood I was dangerous. The contractor would say I interfered with a job site. So I stayed inside, closed the blinds just enough that they could not see me clearly, and started building the only thing stronger than anger: a record. I began with the cameras. I had 2 small security cameras in the backyard, mostly because packages had disappeared from porches the year before. One pointed toward the back gate. The other covered the dogwood trees and the corner of the yard where the shed now stood. I opened the app and went back hour by hour, saving every clip that showed workers crossing my grass, dragging materials over my stone path, and removing part of the old fence. Then I went back further, to the night before construction started. That was when my stomach tightened. Just after 9 in the evening, Linda and Mark appeared near the fence with flashlights. They stood there for several minutes, pointing into my yard. Mark had papers in his hand. Linda kept gesturing toward the dogwood trees and the back corner. A third man, who I later recognized as the contractor's foreman, crouched near the ground and pulled something out from beside the fence post. On the video it looked small, almost meaningless, but I knew exactly what it was. It was one of the old survey stakes left from when I bought the house. I saved that clip 3 different ways. After that, I photographed everything in daylight. I took wide shots from the patio, close-ups of the concrete forms, pictures of the cracked paver, the muddy tire marks, the disturbed flower bed, and the orange paint line where they planned to trench for electricity. I placed a tape measure beside the marks and took more photos. I made a folder on my computer labeled by date, then backed it up to a cloud drive. Every email from the HOA went into that folder, every notice, every message from the community portal, every photo had a timestamp. Then I opened the file cabinet in my office. Inside were the papers I had barely looked at since closing day, the deed, the title documents, the property disclosure, the mortgage survey, and the original boundary drawing I paid for when I bought the house. I spread them across my desk and compared them to the old fence line. That was the first time I saw the detail I had forgotten. The fence was not the legal boundary. The previous owner had installed it slightly inside the property line to avoid damaging tree roots near the back corner. The actual line ran several feet beyond the fence in one section. That meant Linda had not just built too close. If the survey was accurate, she had built on my land. I did not trust myself to read it alone, so I hired a licensed surveyor. I paid extra for the earliest appointment they had. When the surveyor arrived, Linda came outside almost immediately, arms crossed, watching from her patio like she owned the air between our houses. Mark showed up 15 minutes later, pretending he had just happened to be in the area. Neither of them said much, but they did not have to. Their faces said they expected the surveyor to confirm their version. He did not. He used GPS equipment, checked the county plat map, found the original reference points, and placed new markers along the true property line. One marker landed beyond the old fence, exactly where my closing survey suggested it would. Another landed so close to Linda's new shed that the surveyor stopped, looked at the building, and took his own photographs. By the time he was finished, he told me the structure appeared to cross the line by nearly 3 feet at one corner, and the concrete footing extended even farther into my property. I asked him to put everything in writing. That same afternoon, I went to the county website and searched the permit database. I entered Linda's address. Nothing. I searched by parcel number. Nothing. I searched the contractor's company name. There were permits for other jobs in other neighborhoods, but nothing for a shed, nothing for electrical work, and nothing for trenching near our property line. I called the permit office without making accusations. I simply asked what was required for a permanent shed of that size with a concrete base and planned electrical service. The answer was not complicated. HOA approval did not replace a county permit. A structure over a certain size needed a building permit. Electrical work needed a separate electrical permit. Anything near the property line had to respect setback rules, and no private party could run utility lines across another owner's land without a recorded easement. I wrote every word down. Then I emailed the HOA. I kept the tone polite, almost painfully polite. I asked for the documents Mark had relied on when approving the shed location. I asked for the rule that allowed the HOA to designate my deeded land as a shared maintenance strip. I asked for the permit number. I asked for the survey used by the board. I asked them to preserve all emails, meeting notes, architectural review forms, and communications with Linda and the contractor. Their response came the next morning. It was short, defensive, and perfect. They said the board was not required to provide internal review materials to a homeowner who was acting in bad faith. They repeated that the project had been approved and warned me again not to interfere. I printed that email and added it to the folder. By then, I understood something important. Linda had a shed, Mark had a title, the contractor had tools. But I had cameras, a deed, a survey, missing permits, property damage, and written threats from the HOA. So I scheduled a 1-hour consultation with a real estate attorney, expecting him to tell me I was facing months of expensive fighting. Instead, he looked through my documents, paused on the video of Mark and Linda at the fence the night before construction, and told me not to argue with them anymore. He said people like that were comfortable bending the truth in conversation, but permits, surveys, and recorded deeds did not bend nearly as easily. That was the moment I stopped feeling cornered. The next morning, I placed every document into one clean packet. The deed, both surveys, the camera screenshots, the damage photos, the HOA notices, the unanswered permit search, and the attorney's notes. Then I drove to the county permit office, not to complain like an angry neighbor, but to ask one simple question. How did a building with no permit, no setback clearance, and no easement end up on my property with HOA approval? The county permit office did not look like the kind of place where a neighborhood fight would change direction. It was a plain brick building beside the tax assessor's office, with faded signs, old chairs, and a ticket machine that made everyone feel like they were waiting at the DMV. But the moment I placed my folder on the counter, I had a feeling that everything Linda and Mark had been hiding was about to become very hard to explain. I did not start by accusing anyone. I showed the clerk the address, the parcel number, the photos of the shed, and the new survey. I explained that a permanent structure with a concrete footing had been built near the rear property line, that electrical trench markings had appeared across my yard, and that the HOA claimed the project had been approved. The clerk listened quietly, then searched the system by Linda's address. She searched again by parcel number. Then she searched by the contractor's company name. There was nothing. No building permit, no electrical permit, no setback variance, no site plan on file, no inspection request, no application waiting for approval. According to the county, the shed that Linda had been bragging about did not legally exist as an approved project. That was the first turn. The second came when the clerk pulled up the zoning rules for our subdivision. Because Linda's shed was not a small movable box from a hardware store, but a fixed structure on a concrete base, it had to meet accessory structure requirements. It had to sit a certain distance from the property line. In our county, that distance was 5 feet unless a variance had been granted. Linda's shed was not 5 feet from the line. It was not even fully on her side of the line. It crossed into my land at one corner, and the footing reached farther than the walls. The clerk called over a permit supervisor. He looked at my survey, then at the photos, then at the orange trench line crossing my grass. His expression changed when I explained that the planned electrical run would pass through my property. He said an HOA could approve paint colors, fence styles, and exterior appearance under its own rules, but it could not give a homeowner the right to build on land owned by someone else. It also could not authorize electrical work across another parcel without a recorded easement. That word mattered. Easement. Linda did not have one. The HOA did not have one. There was no recorded document giving anyone the right to run power, move materials, pour concrete, or occupy that back corner of my yard. I had checked my deed, and now the county records confirmed it. Then the permit supervisor opened the plat map. That was when Mark's favorite phrase, shared maintenance strip, finally collapsed. There was no shared maintenance strip on the recorded county map. No common area. No utility easement in that location. No HOA-owned buffer. The only thing close to that phrase appeared in an old landscaping diagram the HOA had used years earlier to describe areas volunteers sometimes trimmed near fences. It was not a deed. It was not a legal boundary. It did not transfer ownership. It was a neighborhood maintenance note, and Mark had treated it like a government document. I remember feeling my anger turn into clarity. For days, Linda and Mark had spoken as if I was confused, emotional, and unreasonable. They had acted like the HOA had already settled the matter. But inside that office, surrounded by public records and permit rules, their confidence had no weight. The system did not care who sounded more official. It cared about recorded documents. The permit supervisor told me to file a formal complaint with code enforcement and attach everything I had. I gave them the survey, the photos, the HOA notices, the email where Mark claimed the board approved the location, the permit search results, and the camera still showing Linda, Mark, and the foreman at the fence the night before construction. I also included the clip of the old survey stake being pulled from the ground. I did not know whether that would prove intent, but I knew it proved they had been near the boundary before any workers arrived. That afternoon, my attorney sent a demand letter to Linda, the HOA, and Briggs Outdoor Builds. It ordered them to stop all work, preserve all communications, stay off my property, remove no evidence, and provide every document they had used to justify the shed. The letter also warned that any further digging, electrical work, or construction after notice could increase their liability for trespass, property damage, and possible code violations. Linda's response came faster than I expected. She accused me of turning a simple neighborhood improvement into a legal attack. She claimed the shed was good for the community and said I was hiding behind technicalities because I did not like her. Mark followed with another HOA notice, this one threatening a hearing for hostile conduct toward approved vendors. But this time, those emails did not scare me, they helped me. Every threat they sent after receiving the survey and permit information made the record clearer. I forwarded everything to my attorney and to the county file. By the end of that week, the legal picture was no longer complicated. Linda had built a fixed structure without a permit. The shed violated setback rules. Part of it sat on my property. The planned electrical trench crossed my land without an easement. The HOA had no authority to approve any of it, and the contractor had started work based on paperwork that did not match county records. For the first time since the shed appeared, I slept through the night. On Monday morning, I was pouring coffee when I heard tires slow down outside. Through the front window, I saw a white county vehicle stop at the curb, followed by another truck with code enforcement markings on the door. Linda came out of her house still holding her phone, moving fast, already looking angry. Mark pulled up less than 5 minutes later, only this time, nobody was there to ask for his permission. The county vehicles changed the entire atmosphere of the street. For almost 2 weeks, Linda and Mark had acted like the shed was already settled, like their confidence alone could turn my land into theirs. But when the permit inspector stepped out with a clipboard and the code enforcement officer followed him toward the backyard, all that neighborhood theater disappeared. Suddenly, it was not Linda's opinion against mine. It was not Mark's title against my patience. It was a recorded complaint, a survey, a missing permit, and a structure sitting where the public record said it had no right to sit. Linda tried to take control before anyone reached the gate. She moved quickly across her driveway, waving her phone and insisting that this was a private HOA matter. Mark stood beside her, stiff-backed and red in the face, repeating that the board had already approved the project. He kept using words like architectural review and community standards, as if those phrases could make the county step aside. The inspector did not argue with him. He simply asked for the permit number. Mark looked at Linda. Linda looked at the contractor's foreman. The foreman stared at the shed. That silence did more damage than any argument could have done. We all walked to the back corner together. I stayed on my side of the yard with my folder under one arm, forcing myself not to speak unless someone asked me a question. The county survey markers were still in the ground, bright and impossible to ignore. The corner of the shed crossed past them. The concrete footing pushed even farther over. The orange trench line cut across my grass toward the dogwood trees like a confession painted on the ground. The permit inspector compared the survey to the county map on his tablet. The code enforcement officer took photographs from several angles. Then they measured the distance from the shed to the true property line, not the old fence, not Linda's preferred version, not Mark's imaginary maintenance strip. The number was not close. The shed violated the setback requirement, crossed onto my parcel, and had no permit on file for the structure or the electrical work. That was when the inspector placed the stop work order on the front wall of the shed. It was a bright notice, impossible to miss. taped right across the clean new siding Linda had been so proud of. The contractor's crew stopped unloading tools. One worker quietly carried a saw back to the truck. The foreman started making calls, and his voice got lower with each one. He had been told the HOA approval was enough. Now he was learning, in front of everyone, that an HOA signature could not replace county permits, a recorded easement, or a legal property line. Linda's anger turned frantic. She tried to blame the contractor. Then she blamed Mark. Then she claimed I had moved the markers. But the county had the survey records, the GPS points, and my camera footage showing who had been near the boundary before construction started. Each explanation made her look less like someone who had made a mistake and more like someone trying to escape one. Mark did not do much better. He insisted the board had acted in good faith, but my attorney had already sent over the email where Mark wrote that the board had approved the exact location. He tried to describe the area as shared maintenance space again, but the inspector explained that no such strip existed in the recorded plat. A landscaping note in an HOA file was not ownership. It was not an easement. It was not permission to pour concrete on someone else's land. The situation escalated when Linda demanded that the workers at least move the remaining materials away from the shed. Several stacks of lumber were still sitting in my yard. When two workers stepped over the survey line, I asked them to stop. Linda snapped that I was being ridiculous, but the code enforcement officer looked at the foreman and made it clear that nobody was to enter my property without permission. A sheriff's deputy arrived later that afternoon to keep the peace after Linda kept arguing at the fence. Once he explained that continued entry after notice could become trespassing, even Linda finally went quiet. The emergency HOA meeting happened 3 nights later, and for the first time since I had lived there, the room was packed. People who had ignored the issue when it looked like a simple neighbor dispute now wanted to know whether the board had exposed the entire association to liability. I did not raise my voice. I did not insult Linda. I laid out the timeline: the fence, the workers, the HOA notices, the missing permits, the survey, the video, the stop work order. By the time I finished, Mark was no longer looking at me. He was looking at the other board members, and they were looking at him like he had dragged them into a disaster they had never agreed to understand. The power in the room shifted completely. The people who had told me to cooperate were now asking who authorized the approval. The contractor wanted written confirmation about who would pay for removal. The board wanted legal counsel. Linda wanted the meeting closed. And I sat there with my folder in front of me, realizing that the shed had finally become what it should have been from the beginning. Not a neighborhood argument, evidence. And once the county put everything in writing, the only question left was who would pay to undo the damage. Once the county report was issued, nobody could pretend the shed was a harmless misunderstanding anymore. The stop work order stayed in place, and Linda was given a deadline to remove the structure, break out the concrete footing, and restore the property line area to its original condition. The contractor tried to argue that he had relied on the information Linda and the HOA gave him, but the permit office still cited Briggs Outdoor Builds for starting work without the required building and electrical permits. Their insurance company ended up getting involved because the damage had not happened on Linda's land. It had happened on mine. The removal took 2 full days. I watched from my kitchen window as the same boards that had been dragged across my lawn were carried back out piece by piece. The concrete footing had to be cut and hauled away. The cracked pavers were replaced. The torn grass was reseeded. The flower bed near my mother's dogwood trees was repaired, and a small protective barrier was installed around the roots before any more work could happen near them. Linda had to pay for the demolition, the restoration, part of my attorney's fees, and the survey costs. She also had to sign a written agreement acknowledging the true property line and promising not to enter, build, trench, store materials, or direct contractors onto my land without written permission. It was not dramatic in the way she probably feared. There was no shouting match at the curb, no revenge prank, no public humiliation from me. Just signatures, invoices, deadlines, and consequences. The HOA had its own mess to clean up. Every fine and violation notice they had sent me was withdrawn. The board had to notify the neighborhood that HOA approval did not replace county permits, surveys, setback rules, or private property rights. After several homeowners demanded answers, Mark Ellison stepped down as president before the next election could remove him. The board also changed its architectural review process. Any project near a property line now required a current survey, proof of permit approval when required, and written confirmation that the proposed work did not cross onto another owner's land. As for Linda, she never apologized in a way that sounded real, but she stopped smiling at me like my silence meant weakness. She stopped making comments about unused land, and she stopped walking around the neighborhood like the HOA was a weapon she could point at anyone who told her no. A few weeks later, I put the wooden bench back near the dogwoods. The yard looked different for a while, with fresh soil and new grass trying to grow over the scars, but it was mine again. That was what mattered, not because I yelled louder, not because I scared anyone, and not because I had more power than they did. I won because I kept records, read my deed, checked the survey, asked the permit office the right questions, and refused to let a fake HOA approval erase a real property line. So if you are ever dealing with a neighbor or an HOA that acts like confidence is the same thing as authority, remember this story. Take pictures, save emails, check the county records, get a survey before you let anyone convince you that your land is not really yours. And if you have seen something like this happen in your own neighborhood, leave your thoughts in the comments, share this with someone who needs to hear it, and subscribe for more stories where patience, proof, and the law finally put bullies back behind the line.